This past month, we have been reminded again of the volatile security situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, as yet another deadly escalation between Israel and Palestinian armed factions in Gaza took place. While the ceasefire is holding, conflict mitigation efforts must also be met with steps by both sides, supported by the international community, to reset the trajectory out of the cycle of violence. I call on all parties to stop unilateral and inflammatory actions that undermine prospects for peace and to address the acute financial and institutional challenges faced by the Palestinian Authority. I am particularly alarmed by the funding crisis facing UN agencies supporting basic services and social support, including emergency food assistance to Palestinians. Without new funding, the World Food Programme will suspend cash assistance to some 200,000 Palestinians next week, and UNRWA will not have the resources to deliver core services in September. This comes alongside existing financial challenges faced by the PA and declining donor support overall. I encourage member states to immediately seek ways to increase their support to Palestinians, including funding to UNRWA and WFP, without which we will face serious humanitarian and potentially security challenges. There is no time to spare. Madam President, tension increased between Israel and Palestinian armed factions in Gaza Strip on the 2nd of May, when a Palestinian Islamic Jihad leader, Khader Adnan, died in an Israeli jail following an 86-day hunger strike. In response, PIJ and other armed factions in Gaza fired over 100 rockets towards Israel, causing damage but no injuries. The Israeli Air Forces responded with air attacks against what they said were Hamas and PIJ targets in the Strip, killing one Palestinian and causing damage. Following intensive efforts by Egypt, Qatar, and the UN, hostilities ended on 3 May. 1 week later, in the early hours of 9 May, the Israeli Air Forces carried out airstrikes in Gaza that killed 3 senior members of the PIJ's military wing in their homes. Israeli officials said the 3 were responsible for firing the rockets on the 2nd of May. The strikes against residential structures also killed 10 civilians, family members and neighbors, including women and children. Over 5 days, Israel conducted 323 airstrikes against what he said were PIJ military targets in Gaza, while Palestinian militants, mainly PIJ Al-Quds brigades, launched over 1,200 rockets and more than 250 mortars towards Israel, of which nearly 300 fell short within Gaza, and more than 400 were intercepted by Israeli air defense systems. 33 Palestinians, including at least 12 civilians, 4 women and 6 children, were killed during the hostilities. Of those, 1 Palestinian worker was killed in Israel by rocket fire from Gaza, and the UN is verifying reports that at least 3 fatalities were due to rockets falling short within the Strip. According to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, 190 Palestinians were injured, including at least 38 women and 64 children. 1 Israeli civilian woman was killed by rocket fire. According to Israeli authorities, 6 Israelis were moderately injured and 89 lightly injured. The escalation compounded the already dire humanitarian situation in the Strip. According to the authorities in Gaza, nearly 100 housing units were completely destroyed and more than 125 were damaged and rendered uninhabitable, displacing more than 1,100 Palestinians. Israeli authorities closed both crossings between Gaza and Israel, preventing the entry of food, medical supplies, and fuel for the Gaza power plant. As a result, hundreds of patients were unable to access essential medical care in the West Bank or in Israel. Throughout, the UN engaged intensively with all parties alongside effort by Egypt, together with regional and international partners, including Qatar, to end the hostilities and prevent further loss of life. I commend Egypt for its role in bringing the parties to a ceasefire. Madam President, I am deeply concerned that civilians continue to bear the brunt of such hostilities. I'm particularly appalled that children, who must never be targeted of violence, continue to be victims. I echo the Secretary General's condemnation of the unacceptable loss of civilian lives and his call on Israel to abide by its obligation under international humanitarian law, including the proportional use of force and the taking of all feasible precautions to spare civilians in the conduct of military operations. I also reiterate the Secretary General's condemnation of the launching of indiscriminate rockets from Gaza towards Israel, including from densely populated residential area, which violates international humanitarian law. Madam President, turning to the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the level of violence remains high. 17 Palestinians, including 2 children, were killed, and 138 Palestinians, including 2 women and 23 children, were injured by Israeli security forces during demonstrations, clashes, search and arrest operations, attacks and alleged attacks against the Israelis, and other incidents. Another 24 Palestinians, including 2 children, were injured by Israeli settlers and other civilians in shooting attacks, stone throwing, and other incidents. 33 Israeli civilians, including 4 women, as well as 4 Israeli security forces personnel, were injured by Palestinians in shooting and ramming attacks, clashes, the throwing of stones and Molotov cocktails, and other incidents. As in previous months, many Palestinian casualties occurred in the context of Israeli military operation in Area A and subsequent armed clashes. On 4 May in Nablus, ISF killed 3 Palestinian members of Hamas military wing, who according to ISF were responsible for the April killing of 3 Israeli civilians in the Jordan Valley. ISF also killed 3 Palestinians during an operation in Kabatia, south of Jenin, on 10 May, one of whom was an unarmed bystander. 3 Palestinians were killed while carrying out attacks on alleged attacks against the Israeli security forces, an alleged ramming attack near Salfit on 27 April, a stabbing attack in Uvara near Nablus by a Palestinian woman, resulting in light injury on 4 May, and an alleged stabbing attempt at a checkpoint west of Jenin on 13 May. During the reporting period, the Israeli forces imposed significant movement restrictions, particularly around Jericho, Nablus, and Hebron, following either Palestinian attacks or stone throwing, affecting tens of thousands of Palestinians and their local economies. Thousands of right-wing Israeli activists, including senior government ministers, participated in the highly provocative annual Flag Day march through Jerusalem's old city, marking Jerusalem Day. Many chanted racist slogans, including "Death of Arabs," with scuffles breaking out between Israeli participants and Palestinians. Israelis also threw bottles and objects towards media covering the event, injuring 2 journalists. Such provocations and incitements, which continued in the days after the march, are unacceptable and must be condemned by all. I also reiterate that the status quo at the holy sites must be respected. Levels of settler-related violence also remain high, with 5 Palestinians shot and injured by Israeli settlers using live ammunition. I reiterate that all perpetrators of violence must be held accountable and swiftly brought to justice. Security forces must exercise maximum restraint and use lethal force only when strictly unavoidable to protect life. Madam President, from 3 to 4 May, the Ad hoc Liaison Committee convened in Brussels, where the parties and donors discussed measures to support Palestinian institution building and strengthen the Palestinian Authority and economy. The chair's summary called on both sides to implement previous agreements between them, commit to de-escalation, and refrain from steps that undermine Palestinian institutions and the two-state solution, while calling on the international community to increase assistance to Palestinians, including through support to UNRWA. Madam President, I regret to observe more settlement plans being moved forward, with tenders published for some 310 housing units in Area C, and demolitions continuing. On 18 May, the Israeli military issued an order in line with Knesset March amendment to the 2005 disengagement law to allow Israel to re-enter the area of the evacuated settlement of Homesh, built on private Palestinian-owned land in the northern West Bank. During the reporting period, Israeli authorities seized or forced owners to demolish 33 Palestinian-owned structures in Area C and 17 in East Jerusalem, including a donor-funded school east of Bethlehem, displacing 89 Palestinians, including 45 children. The demolitions were carried out due to the lack of Israeli-issued building permits, which are nearly impossible for Palestinians to obtain. On 7 May, the Israeli High Court of Justice rejected a petition to compel Israeli authorities to carry out demolition orders against the Palestinian village of Khan el-Ahmar. The justices agreed with the Israeli government's position that the court should not intervene in setting a timeline for the demolition. The court also agreed that the demolition would not be carried out at this time, citing Israel's security and foreign relations. I reiterate that all settlements are illegal under international law, and they are a substantial obstacle to peace and must stop. I also call on Israeli authorities to end the displacements and eviction of Palestinians and approve plans that would enable Palestinians to build legally and address their development needs. Turning to the region, Madam President, on the Golan, while the ceasefire between Israel and Syria has been generally maintained, the situation continues to be volatile due to violations of the 1974 disengagement of force agreement by the parties. The situation along the Blue Line remains stable following the 6th April breach of the cessation of hostilities. Madam President, in recent weeks, the UN, together with regional and international partners, mobilized once again to end hostilities between armed factions in Gaza and Israel. Such efforts are crucial to saving Palestinian and Israeli lives. Nevertheless, we must also keep issues fundamental to creating the condition for a lasting peace at the forefront. The immediate priority is to support steps to bolster the PA and preserve critical services for the Palestinian people. These steps should be implemented in a way that encourages the Palestinians to engage with each other, the parties to engage with each other, including on underlying political issues. This requires greater effort by Israel and Palestinian leaders, alongside increased support and attention from the international community. We must take action not only to ensure Palestinian well-being and governance, but as an integral part of ending the occupation and restoring a political horizon towards a viable two-state solution, based on UN resolution, international law, and previous agreements.